In the dusty twilight of 69 BCE, as the Nile swelled with its annual flood, a child was born in the royal palace of Alexandria. She was small, delicate, and seemingly ordinary at first glance, but her arrival would ripple through centuries of history. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philopator, the daughter of Ptolemy XII Auletes, a pharaoh more famous for his music than for his statesmanship, and a mother whose identity remained shrouded in mystery. The city of her birth was unlike any other in the world. Alexandria, founded by Alexander the Great, was a jewel of the Mediterranean. Its white marble temples shimmered in the sun. The great pharaoh's lighthouse guided ships from leagues away, and the Library of Alexandria whispered with scrolls holding the knowledge of ages. Cleopatra entered life at the beating heart of culture, trade, and learning, a place where Greek philosophers, Egyptian priests, Jewish scholars, and Roman merchants brushed shoulders in crowded streets. From the very beginning, Cleopatra's destiny was intertwined with both Egypt's ancient traditions and the ambitions of her Greek ancestors. Her family, the Ptolemies, were not native Egyptians, but Macedonian Greeks who had ruled for nearly 3 centuries since Alexander's death. They spoke Greek, married within their own bloodline, and styled themselves as divine kings in the manner of the pharaohs. Yet beneath their golden crowns lay a fragile dynasty, riddled with intrigue, greed, and betrayal. Cleopatra grew up in a palace filled with tension. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, known mockingly as Auletes or the flute player, had spent vast sums to bribe Roman senators in order to keep his throne secure. His reign was marked by debt, weakness, and the constant shadow of Roman intervention. The young princess must have watched and listened, absorbing the lessons of politics, not from tutors, but from the bitter struggles of her family. In the corridors of the palace, whispers of assassination and exile were as common as prayers to the gods. But Cleopatra was no ordinary royal child. Unlike many of her siblings, she possessed an insatiable curiosity and a sharp intellect. From an early age, she studied not only the Greek classics, but also immersed herself in Egyptian traditions. Where other Ptolemies dismissed the native culture, Cleopatra embraced it. She learned the Egyptian language, becoming the first of her dynasty to speak directly to her people in their own tongue. To the priests of Isis and the farmers along the Nile, this was more than novelty. It was a sign of respect, a bridge between ruler and ruled. Her education was rigorous. Tutors schooled her in philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, literature, and medicine. She read Homer and Plato, but also studied the sacred texts of Egypt. She learned to debate with clarity, to persuade with elegance, and to command with authority. It was said that Cleopatra's voice alone could bend a listener's will, that she carried in her words the power of both seduction and reason. Outside the palace, Egypt was a land of contrasts. The fertile Nile Valley sustained millions, while beyond its banks stretched the unforgiving desert. The people depended on the annual floods, the gods' favor, and the wisdom or folly of their rulers. Yet by Cleopatra's childhood, Egypt was no longer the mighty empire it once had been. It was a client state of Rome, its riches eyed by senators and generals across the sea. Every decision in Alexandria reverberated in Rome, and every quarrel within the Ptolemaic family risked opening the gates to foreign domination. Within this storm of politics, Cleopatra's character began to take shape. Observers later remarked that she was not the most beautiful woman of her age, but she possessed something far more powerful: presence. Her eyes were said to be magnetic, her manner captivating, her wit disarming. She could disarm an enemy with charm, a rival with cleverness, and a crowd with eloquence. Yet as a girl, she was also surrounded by danger. Her siblings were not companions, but rivals. In the Ptolemaic tradition, brother often turned against sister, mother against child, as each clawed for the throne. Cleopatra must have grown up with the awareness that affection was fleeting and trust could be deadly. Every smile in the palace might hide a dagger. Still, she learned to survive. She learned to wait. And in the quiet hours of the night, perhaps she wandered the balconies of the palace, gazing over the harbor of Alexandria, where ships from Rome, Greece, and Africa clustered like restless birds. Perhaps she whispered to herself that she was destined for more than survival. The little girl born amid the flickering torchlight of the palace nursery would one day shake the world. Cleopatra was not yet queen, not yet the lover of Caesar or Antony, not yet the legend who would outshine even Rome's greatest rulers. But already in the hush of her childhood, destiny was stirring. Egypt's last pharaoh had entered the stage of history, and the world would never be the same. The Palace of Alexandria was never a place of innocence. By the time Cleopatra reached her teenage years, she had already witnessed enough betrayal and intrigue to know that royalty was both a gift and a curse. Her father, Ptolemy XII, clung to his throne only through Rome's favor, paying for it with heavy taxes that burdened his people and bribes that emptied Egypt's treasury. When unrest flared, the king fled into exile, leaving his young children behind in a city seething with anger. For Cleopatra, it was a lesson written in fire. Power belonged not to the weak, and survival was a game played with ruthless precision. In 51 BCE, fate struck its decisive chord. Ptolemy XII died, leaving the throne to his 18-year-old daughter Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was barely 10. On papyrus, they ruled together as co-monarchs. In reality, it was a ticking time bomb. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a long tradition of siblings ruling side by side, and an even longer tradition of siblings turning on each other. For Cleopatra, the crown came with the certainty that betrayal was inevitable. From the moment she ascended the throne, Cleopatra sought to assert herself as the true ruler. While her brother's advisors tried to reduce her to a ceremonial figure, she moved quickly to consolidate her authority. She appeared before the people in full pharaonic regalia, speaking not only in Greek but also in Egyptian, evoking the gods of the Nile with confidence. She had the daring to present herself not merely as a queen, but as a living goddess, Isis reborn in flesh. Her youth did not make her timid, it sharpened her will. Yet opposition gathered like storm clouds. The guardians of Ptolemy XIII, led by the ambitious regent Pothinus, saw Cleopatra as an obstacle to their own control. They whispered against her in the palace halls, portraying her as reckless, extravagant, even dangerous. Within a year, they forced her from Alexandria, stripping her of power and driving her into exile. Cleopatra, not yet 20, found herself wandering the harsh landscapes of Syria with only a handful of loyal supporters. But exile was not the end of her story. It was the forge that tempered her into steel. In Syria, Cleopatra raised an army, gathering mercenaries who would fight for her return. She wrote letters to allies, appealed to local rulers, and plotted not just survival, but revenge.
She had tasted power, and she would not surrender it. The desert winds may have stung her skin, but within her burned a fire stronger than ever. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, her brother's court descended into chaos. Factions bickered, the economy faltered, and the shadow of Rome loomed ever larger. Egypt was too wealthy, too strategic, too tempting for Rome to ignore. It was at this moment, as brother and sister fought for the throne, that destiny carried a new player into the drama: Julius Caesar. Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BCE, fresh from his victory at Pharsalus over Pompey the Great. Pompey himself had sought refuge in Egypt, only to be treacherously murdered on the orders of Ptolemy XIII's advisors, who believed the act would please Caesar. Instead, Caesar was horrified and angered. Egypt's royal siblings had invited the wrath of the most powerful man in the world, and Cleopatra, ever the strategist, saw opportunity gleaming within this crisis. Legend tells us that Cleopatra didn't simply walk into Caesar's camp. Instead, she had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled up inside a carpet, or perhaps, as some accounts say, hidden in a sack of linen. When the bundle was unrolled before Caesar, the young queen emerged not as a supplicant, but as a vision, confident, intelligent, and utterly unforgettable. In that single moment, Cleopatra shifted the balance of power. She knew how to speak to Caesar, not with flattery, but with brilliance. She outlined her claim to the throne, presented herself as Egypt's rightful ruler, and offered alliance instead of submission. Caesar, who admired intelligence as much as beauty, was captivated. To him, Cleopatra was not just another monarch begging for Roman protection. She was a partner, an equal, a woman who matched his own ambition with her own. The alliance was sealed not only with words, but with passion. Cleopatra and Caesar became lovers, their union scandalizing many, but cementing her return to power. With Roman legions backing her cause, Cleopatra fought a bloody civil war against her brother's forces. The battle culminated in the destruction of Ptolemy XIII's army, and the young king himself drowned in the Nile while fleeing. Cleopatra emerged victorious. She was once again Queen of Egypt, not as a puppet, not as a co-ruler, but as sovereign in her own right. At her side was Caesar, the most powerful man in the world, and within her womb grew a son who would carry both Egyptian and Roman blood. But Cleopatra's rise to power was no fairy tale. It was bought with cunning, risk, and the willingness to stake everything on her intellect and her courage. She had faced exile, betrayal, and war, and she had returned stronger each time. Now, seated on her throne in Alexandria, Cleopatra knew she had secured more than just survival. She had claimed her place in history. For Egypt, her reign promised stability after decades of chaos. For Rome, her presence promised fascination and fear in equal measure. And for Cleopatra herself, the true journey was only beginning.
When Cleopatra and Julius Caesar first stood face to face, the world seemed to hold its breath. Here was a young queen in exile, brilliant and audacious, and here was Rome's most powerful general, weary from civil war, but hungry for new triumphs. Their meeting in the palace at Alexandria was not merely political. It was the collision of two destinies that would shape both Egypt and Rome. For Cleopatra, Caesar represented survival. Without him, her exile might stretch into oblivion, her throne lost forever. But she did not approach him as a beggar. Instead, she dazzled him with intelligence, wit, and vision.
Ancient accounts describe how she spoke with confidence about Egypt's wealth, her understanding of statecraft, and her dream of restoring her kingdom's greatness. Caesar, who had dealt with countless monarchs groveling for Rome's approval, found in Cleopatra something different, not submission, but partnership. Their alliance was sealed quickly, both politically and personally. The Roman general, already in his 50s, was captivated by Cleopatra's charisma, her courage, and her ability to match him in conversation. She, in turn, saw in Caesar not just a lover, but the key to securing Egypt's independence. To align herself with Rome's most powerful man was to shield her throne from rivals, both within Egypt and beyond. Yet their union was not without danger. Ptolemy XIII's supporters raged at Cleopatra's return, and soon Alexandria was plunged into civil war. Caesar found himself besieged in the royal quarter, his small force of Roman soldiers trapped by the much larger Egyptian army. It was a perilous moment. Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, nearly undone in the streets of Alexandria. Cleopatra was at his side throughout the crisis. While Roman engineers fought to hold the harbor and flames consumed parts of the city, she maneuvered politically, rallying allies and spreading word of her legitimacy. For weeks, the city teetered on the edge of disaster. But Caesar's reinforcements eventually arrived, and in the climactic Battle of the Nile, Ptolemy XIII's forces were crushed. The young king himself drowned while attempting to flee across the river, his golden armor dragging him into the depths. With her brother gone, Cleopatra's position was secure. Caesar reinstated her as queen, but Egyptian tradition required a co-ruler. Thus, she was formally married to her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, though the boy was little more than a ceremonial figure. In truth, Cleopatra ruled alone, her throne unshakable at last. It was during this period that Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Caesarion, Little Caesar. To the Egyptians, he was the heir of the pharaohs, born of the goddess Isis herself. To the Romans, he was more controversial, the child of Julius Caesar, though never officially acknowledged by him. For Cleopatra, Caesarion was more than just a child. He was a symbol. Through him, she bound Egypt's destiny to Rome's, weaving her family into the fabric of two empires. The Queen and Caesar did not confine themselves to Alexandria. Together, they embarked on a grand journey along the Nile, sailing in magnificent barges draped in silk and perfumed with incense. They visited temples, honored the gods, and displayed themselves before their people as living deities, Cleopatra as Isis, Caesar as Osiris reborn. For the Egyptian people, this spectacle was breathtaking. Their queen not only restored, but elevated to divine heights. For Caesar, the journey was equally significant. He was fascinated by Egypt's ancient culture, its monuments, and its immense resources. Standing before the pyramids, older than Rome itself, he must have felt both awe and ambition. Some Roman historians later whispered that Cleopatra sought to seduce him with visions of empire, offering Egypt's riches in exchange for her protection. Whether true or not, the bond between them grew ever stronger. But in Rome, scandal brewed. News of Caesar's affair with the Egyptian queen spread quickly, provoking outrage among senators and citizens alike. Many saw Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign temptress, corrupting their leader. The fact that Caesar allowed her to reside in his villa when she visited Rome and even dedicated golden statues to her in the Temple of Venus shocked Roman sensibilities. To them, it seemed as though his general was placing Egyptian queen above Roman matrons, even above the republic itself. Yet Caesar, for all his pragmatism, did not abandon her. He brought Cleopatra to Rome, where she was received with a mixture of fascination and hostility. Crowds gawked at her exotic dress, her retinue, and the little boy at her side. The senators muttered in disapproval, fearing that Caesar might one day seek to crown himself king with Cleopatra as his queen. In their eyes, this was more than scandal. It was the threat of monarchy reborn in Rome. For Cleopatra, her time in Rome was both triumph and peril. She walked the streets of the greatest city in the world as an equal to its ruler, a foreign queen treated like an empress. Yet she also sensed the danger, the thin line Caesar walked between adoration and hatred. She had bound her fate to him, but she knew well that Rome was a place where fortunes could shift with the strike of a dagger. Still, in those years, Cleopatra secured what she needed most: legitimacy, protection, and a son who tied her dynasty to Rome itself. She had risen from exile and defeat to stand beside the most powerful man alive. And though storms loomed on the horizon, in this moment, Cleopatra's star blazed brightly across both Egypt and Rome.
Cleopatra's years in Rome were a paradox of splendor and risk. On one hand, she had secured Julius Caesar's protection, ensuring her throne in Egypt. On the other, she had placed herself in the midst of Rome's volatile politics, where jealousy and suspicion swirled like storm clouds. To the Roman people, she was a curiosity, an exotic monarch who arrived with silks, incense, and jewels, her very presence a living reminder that Caesar was not only their leader, but a man entangled with a foreign queen. For the Senate, Cleopatra was far more than curiosity. She was a threat. Caesar's open display of her presence in Rome, and worse, of their son Caesarion, struck at the heart of Roman tradition. Rome prided itself on being a republic, a state without kings, yet here was their general hosting a queen in his villa across the Tiber, giving her golden honors in the temples and whispering of dynasties that might unite Rome and Egypt. To conservative senators, it looked like monarchy reborn. The rumors only grew louder. Whispers spread that Caesar intended to crown himself king of Rome, with Cleopatra at his side, perhaps even to move the capital eastward to Alexandria. Whether true or exaggerated, such talk was poison in a city that still remembered the proud expulsion of its last king centuries before. Caesar's enemies seized on these fears, fueling resentment in the Senate and among the people. Through all this, Cleopatra played her part with grace. She did not shrink from the hostility, but met it with regal composure. She dressed not in Roman fashion, but in Egyptian splendor, asserting her identity as a sovereign equal to Caesar, not his mistress. She entertained philosophers, charmed visiting diplomats, and impressed those who could see beyond prejudice. Yet she must have felt the undercurrent of danger. Rome was not Alexandria. Here, power was fragile, and envy sharper than any blade. Then came the Ides of March, 44 BCE. On that fateful day, Julius Caesar entered the theater of Pompeii, unaware that a conspiracy of senators lay in wait. Among them were men he trusted, men he had pardoned, men who feared his growing dominance. As he took his seat, daggers flashed. The mighty conqueror of Gaul, the master of Rome, fell under a storm of blows, stabbed 23 times by those he once called allies. With his blood on the marble floor, the future of Rome and Cleopatra's own destiny was thrown into chaos. For Cleopatra, the news was devastating. Her protector, her lover, the father of her child was gone. In an instant, the delicate web she had woven unraveled. She had staked everything on Caesar: her throne, her safety, her vision of a dynasty bridging Rome and Egypt.
Now she was a foreign queen stranded in a hostile city, vulnerable to the wrath of Caesar's enemies. She acted swiftly. Fearing for her life and the life of Caesarion, she withdrew from Rome. Within weeks, she sailed back to Alexandria, carrying with her both sorrow and determination. She had lost her ally, but not her throne. Egypt remained hers to rule, and she would not surrender it to fate. The question that haunted her was what would come next. Rome was plunged into turmoil. Caesar's assassins claimed they had restored liberty, but in truth, they had unleashed civil war. His allies, led by Mark Antony and the young Octavian, vowed revenge. Cleopatra watched from Alexandria as Rome tore itself apart, knowing that whichever faction triumphed would soon turn its gaze toward Egypt. She also knew that her position was precarious. Her co-ruler, the boy, Ptolemy XIV, was a potential rival, and whispers spread that he might one day challenge her or betray her to Rome. Cleopatra did not leave matters to chance. In the shadows of the palace, the young king met a sudden and suspicious death, likely poisoned at Cleopatra's command. With him gone, she elevated Caesarion to the throne as her co-ruler, declaring him the rightful heir not only of Egypt, but of Julius Caesar himself. It was a bold and dangerous move. To proclaim Caesarion as Caesar's son was to challenge Rome directly. For Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, would never tolerate a rival claimant. Yet Cleopatra was not reckless. She understood the power of symbols, and in Caesarion, she saw a living bridge between her dynasty and Caesar's legacy. By placing him on the throne, she anchored her rule in both Egyptian tradition and Roman memory. In the years that followed, Cleopatra governed with the same brilliance that had carried her through exile and war. She strengthened Egypt's economy, reopened trade routes, and patronized scholars and priests. She also prepared for the inevitable, the moment when Rome's victors would demand her allegiance. Her palace became both a court of elegance and a fortress of strategy, where she weighed every rumor from Rome and calculated her next move. Cleopatra had gambled everything on Julius Caesar, and though she lost him, she refused to surrender her vision. Egypt would not be a pawn, not while she still lived. The queen who once wrapped herself in a carpet to meet a general, now wrapped herself in destiny itself, waiting for the next chapter of Rome's civil wars to bring her the ally or the adversary who would decide the fate of her throne. For in the ashes of Caesar's death, a new power was rising. Mark Antony, the fiery general whose path would soon cross hers in a union as passionate, perilous, and legendary as any in history.
The years after Caesar's assassination were a whirlwind of chaos in Rome. His killers, Brutus and Cassius, fled eastward, while his allies, Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, formed the Second Triumvirate, a fragile alliance forged in vengeance. Their armies clashed against Caesar's assassins at Philippi, where Antony's brilliance in the battlefield secured victory. With Brutus and Cassius dead, Rome was carved into spheres of influence. Octavian took the west, Antony the east, and Lepidus the scraps in between. For Cleopatra, this division was both an opportunity and a peril. Egypt, lying at the crossroads of east and west, was too rich and too vital to escape Rome's notice. Whoever controlled the east would inevitably turn to Alexandria, demanding loyalty, tribute, or conquest. Cleopatra knew she could not afford missteps. She had survived Caesar's death, secured her throne, and elevated Caesarion as co-ruler, but the game was far from over. Now a new Roman strongman held sway over her world, Mark Antony. Antony was no Caesar. Where Caesar had been calculating, disciplined, and visionary, Antony was larger than life, impulsive and passionate. A soldier at heart, he was adored by his troops, feared by his enemies, and infamous for his indulgence in drink and pleasure. Yet beneath the bravado lay a shrewd politician who understood that Egypt's wealth and Cleopatra's loyalty could tip the balance in his struggle against Octavian. Their meeting in 41 BCE became legend.
Summoned to Tarsus in Cilicia, Cleopatra did not arrive as a supplicant queen, but as a goddess incarnate. Sailing up the Cydnus River, she reclined beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Isis, the mother goddess, her attendants fanning her with peacock feathers, while the air filled with the scent of incense and the sound of flutes. Antony, who prided himself on excess, found himself outdone. Cleopatra had staged not a political negotiation, but a theatrical triumph, asserting that she was no mere client queen, but a monarch whose presence could rival Rome's greatest general. Antony was captivated. Theirs was not merely a political alliance, but an affair that soon consumed them both. Cleopatra saw in Antony a protector strong enough to secure her throne and Caesarion's inheritance. Antony, in turn, found in her a partner who offered not just wealth, but a vision of empire that stretched beyond Rome. Together they forged a bond of passion and ambition, entwining their fates in ways neither could yet foresee. Back in Alexandria, Antony abandoned Roman restraint and embraced Cleopatra's world. He dressed as a Greek, joined her in feasts that lasted for days, and even formed a private society known as the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to pleasure, wine, and wit. To Roman eyes, this was scandalous. One of their greatest generals seduced by an Eastern queen, surrendering to decadence. To Cleopatra's subjects, it was divine theater, their queen ruling alongside a Roman demigod, both wrapped in the mantle of Isis and Dionysus. Yet beneath the revelry, serious matters unfolded. Cleopatra secured Antony's promise to eliminate her rivals. Her sister, Arsinoe, once spared after Caesar's triumph, was executed on Antony's orders, her blood spilled on temple steps at Ephesus. Cleopatra also won territorial concessions. Antony granted her lands in Syria, Phoenicia, and Cyprus, expanding Egypt's influence and restoring the Ptolemaic Empire to a strength unseen in generations. Antony, too, gained from the union. Egypt's treasure funded his campaigns against Parthia, Rome's eastern nemesis. Cleopatra supplied ships, soldiers, and gold, bolstering his power as he prepared for war. For a time, it seemed a perfect marriage of necessity and desire, Rome's general and Egypt's queen united against common foes. But shadows loomed. In Rome, Octavian watched with growing alarm. Antony was supposed to be his ally, yet here he was, living in Alexandria, raising children with Cleopatra and playing the king in a foreign court. Octavian, ever the strategist, understood how to wield propaganda. He painted Antony not as a hero, but as a traitor, bewitched by a foreign temptress. To the Roman public, Cleopatra became a new Helen of Troy, the woman who lured a Roman away from his duty, threatening to drag the Republic into ruin for her own ambitions. But Cleopatra did not shrink from this portrayal. She leaned into her role as goddess queen, presenting herself as the living Isis, mother of divine heirs. In 36 BCE, she bore Antony twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, cementing their union with blood and legacy. Later, she gave him another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. To her, this was dynastic destiny, the merging of Egyptian divinity and Roman power into a new line of rulers who might one day govern East and West. The dream was grand, but reality was harsher. Antony's Parthian campaign ended in disaster, with his armies retreating through snow and starvation. Though Cleopatra supplied aid and refuge, the failure weakened his standing. In contrast, Octavian grew stronger, consolidating control over Rome, portraying himself as the defender of Roman values against Antony's Eastern corruption. Still, Antony and Cleopatra pressed forward. In Alexandria, they staged the famous Donations of Alexandria, a lavish ceremony in which Antony distributed Eastern territories to Cleopatra and their children. Caesarion was proclaimed the rightful heir of Julius Caesar, King of Kings, while Antony and Cleopatra sat enthroned as living deities. To Egypt, it was triumph. To Rome, it was treason. The line had been drawn. What began as passion and alliance had transformed into a direct challenge to Octavian's power. Cleopatra and Antony no longer stood merely as lovers. They stood as rivals to Rome itself. The storm that would decide their fate, and the fate of Egypt, was gathering.
By the late 30s BCE, the fragile peace within the Roman world had collapsed into suspicion and rivalry.
Octavian and Antony, once bound by their allegiance to Julius Caesar, now stood as inevitable adversaries. Each controlled half of Rome's vast dominion, yet each desired total supremacy. Between them lay Cleopatra, not merely a queen, but the symbol of a larger vision, an Egypt allied with Antony, challenging Rome's dominance with wealth, culture, and divine authority. Octavian was a master of patience and propaganda. He knew that Antony, a veteran soldier and beloved commander, could not be easily beaten on the battlefield. Instead, Octavian set out to defeat him in the minds of the Roman people. He depicted Antony not as a Roman general, but as a man corrupted by an Eastern queen, bewitched by Cleopatra's charms, abandoning his duty to Rome. Every whisper became a weapon. Antony drank too much. Antony wore Greek robes. Antony bowed before a foreign goddess. Rome, Octavian warned, was not fighting Antony, it was fighting Cleopatra. This strategy was brilliant. By turning Cleopatra into the villain, Octavian framed the coming war not as a civil war between Romans, but as a noble struggle against a foreign threat. It was not brother against brother, but Rome against Egypt, order against decadence, discipline against excess. The Senate, persuaded by Octavian's rhetoric, declared war on Cleopatra in 32 BCE. Antony's name was not mentioned, but the meaning was clear. He had tied his fate to hers. In Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra responded with their own display of power. They held court as gods incarnate, she as Isis, he as Dionysus, presenting themselves as rulers of a new world order. At the grand donations of Alexandria, they distributed eastern territories to their children. Caesarion was named King of Kings. Alexander Helios received Armenia and Media. Cleopatra Selene was given Cyrenaica, and Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria. It was a vision of empire that rivaled Rome itself, a dynasty born of Egypt and Rome united. To their followers, it was a breathtaking promise. To Octavian, it was treason. The clash was inevitable. Both sides prepared for war, amassing fleets and armies. Antony commanded legions hardened in battle, supported by Cleopatra's treasure and Egypt's ships. Octavian, though less experienced in war, had the loyalty of the western provinces and the political machinery of Rome behind him. In 31 BCE, the two forces met near the western coast of Greece at Actium. The Battle of Actium would become one of the most decisive conflicts in ancient history. Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, vast and majestic, was anchored in the Ambracian Gulf, protected by towering warships. Octavian's navy, led by his brilliant admiral Agrippa, was smaller but swifter, designed for maneuver rather than sheer power. For weeks, the two forces danced in a stalemate, each waiting for the other to falter. Antony's position was perilous. His troops on land suffered from disease and dwindling supplies, while Octavian's fleet harassed his ships and cut off reinforcements. Cleopatra urged retreat to Egypt, where their resources could be replenished, but Antony hesitated, torn between pride and necessity. The delay proved costly. On September 2, 31 BCE, the stalemate broke. Agrippa launched a daring assault, drawing Antony's fleet into open waters. The battle was fierce, with Roman and Egyptian ships clashing in a storm of fire and steel. Cleopatra, commanding her own fleet, had positioned herself at the rear, ready to act. In the chaos, she made her move, sailing through a gap in the battle line, her ships retreating southward toward Egypt. What happened next became legend. Seeing Cleopatra withdraw, Antony abandoned the fight and followed her with a handful of ships, leaving his fleet leaderless. To his enemies, it was proof of his ruin. Antony, once Rome's greatest general, had chosen love over duty, deserting his men for a queen. To his defenders, it was a desperate gamble, an attempt to regroup and fight another day. But the result was the same. Octavian's fleet triumphed, Antony's forces crumbled, and the war was lost. Back in Rome, Octavian seized the moment. He declared that Antony had betrayed Rome for Cleopatra, that he had become a slave to a foreign temptress. The Senate and people, already inflamed by propaganda, saw Actium not as the defeat of a general, but as the salvation of Rome from Eastern domination. Cleopatra was cast as the new Helen of Troy, the woman who had nearly undone the greatest empire in the world. For Antony and Cleopatra, the retreat to Egypt was not the end, but the beginning of the final chapter. They still held Alexandria, still commanded wealth and loyal armies, still dreamed of recovering their strength. Yet the balance had shifted irrevocably. Octavian was no longer just Caesar's heir. He was the master of Rome, his path to absolute power clear. The lovers who had dared to challenge the might of Rome now found themselves cornered, their empire shrinking, their options fading. The desert sun still glinted off the domes of Alexandria. The Nile still flowed with timeless grace, but the shadow of Octavian stretched ever closer. The end of Cleopatra's story was near, and with it, the end of a dynasty that had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries.
The year after Actium was a year of dread in Alexandria. News traveled fast along the sea routes. Octavian was triumphant. Antony's allies were fleeing, and Rome now looked upon Egypt not as a partner, but as prey. For Cleopatra and Antony, the splendid capital of the Ptolemies became both sanctuary and cage, its golden palaces gleaming under the sun, while shadows of inevitable defeat lengthened across the Nile. Antony, once the fiery general adored by legions, was broken by Actium. His spirit, so long unshaken by war, now bent under the weight of humiliation. Reports told of entire armies deserting to Octavian, provinces switching allegiance, and even trusted governors betraying his cause. He wandered the halls of the palace in bouts of rage and despair, sometimes drinking to numb his sorrow, other times imagining reckless plans of resistance. His soldiers, once fiercely loyal, now looked to him with uneasy eyes, waiting but no longer believing. Cleopatra, however, did not yield to despair. The queen who had charmed Julius Caesar and enthralled Antony now turned her mind to survival. She filled her treasury with what remained of Egypt's wealth: gold, jewels, grain, and ships. She tested every possible escape: secret envoys to Arabia, negotiations with neighboring kingdoms, even whispers of an alliance with Octavian himself. If Antony had lost faith, Cleopatra had not. She still believed Egypt could endure. If not through war, then through diplomacy, deception, or charm. But Octavian was not to be swayed. He had learned from Caesar's mistakes. Egypt was too wealthy, too strategic, and too independent to be left in the hands of a queen. He sent messages to Cleopatra, promising leniency if she betrayed Antony, hinting at mercy if she surrendered her crown. Cleopatra entertained these overtures, perhaps to buy time, perhaps to test Octavian's resolve. Antony, when he discovered them, felt the sting of betrayal. Their once unbreakable bond now wavered, strained by defeat, mistrust, and the looming presence of Rome's young conqueror. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian marched on Alexandria. His legions swept through the eastern Mediterranean, facing little resistance, and by August they encircled the fabled city. The sight must have been terrifying. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers arrayed against Egypt's defenses, their discipline forged in decades of conquest. Antony rallied what forces remained, determined to make a last stand. To his followers, he declared that he would rather die in battle than be paraded as a prisoner in Rome. Cleopatra, ever pragmatic, fortified herself within her mausoleum, a grand stone tomb she had built for herself, filled with treasures, as if preparing for either bargaining or death.
The final clash came quickly. Antony led a desperate cavalry charge outside the city walls, but many of his men, weary and disillusioned, defected to Octavian before the fighting began. Betrayal spread like wildfire. One by one, commanders abandoned him. Defeated, Antony retreated into Alexandria, only to be told that Cleopatra had locked herself within her mausoleum and that she had taken her own life. Stricken with grief, Antony fell upon his sword. The story does not end so neatly, for Cleopatra had not yet died. When Antony, bleeding but alive, was carried to her tomb, the queen received him with cries of anguish. According to legend, she refused to open the gates, fearing capture, so Antony was hoisted up through a window and died in her arms. His last words were of love and regret, of loyalty to her and of bitterness towards his fate. Thus ended Marcus Antonius, the Roman general who had once dreamed of ruling the world, undone by love and ambition. Octavian entered Alexandria soon after. The city surrendered, its people stunned into silence by the fall of their defenders. Cleopatra, still cloistered in her mausoleum, received Octavian's envoys. She sought to secure the throne for Caesarion, her son by Julius Caesar, pleading that he was the rightful heir of a godlike lineage. Octavian coldly refused. He had no intention of allowing another Caesar to rise, especially one born of Egypt's queen. Days later, Octavian himself visited Cleopatra. Ancient accounts differ on what passed between them. Some say he threatened her with humiliation, promising to drag her through Rome in chains as a trophy of conquest. Others claim he offered her mercy if she yielded completely. But Cleopatra, proud to the end, recognized the truth. Her reign was over, her dynasty broken. She would not suffer the fate of a captive queen. On August 12, 30 BCE, Cleopatra prepared for her final act. Clad in regal robes, she reclined upon a golden couch within her mausoleum. By her side were her loyal attendants, Iris and Charmian. A basket of figs was brought to her, and within it, concealed, lay the venomous asp, the serpent sacred to her people, symbol of divine kingship and eternity. Taking the snake, Cleopatra pressed it to her flesh. Its bite brought swift death, a union of poison and will. When Octavian's soldiers burst in, they found her lifeless, radiant in death, as though she had chosen to become a goddess rather than a prisoner. With her passing, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended, and Egypt became a Roman province. Caesarion was captured and executed, though Octavian spared Cleopatra's younger children, sending them to be raised in Rome. Antony and Cleopatra were buried together, their tomb becoming a place of legend. Alexandria, though it remained a jewel of the Mediterranean, now shone under Roman rule, no longer the capital of a kingdom, but the province of an empire. For Octavian, the victory was total. With Egypt's wealth at his disposal, he returned to Rome not merely as a conqueror, but as the unchallenged master of the known world. Soon, he would take the name Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. For Antony and Cleopatra, their lives ended in tragedy, but their story would echo across centuries. Two lovers who dared to defy the greatest empire on earth and who chose death on their own terms rather than submission.
The death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE did not mark the end of her story. It marked the beginning of her legend. Though her body lay in a tomb beside Antony, her spirit traveled far beyond the sands of Egypt. She became a figure of fascination, controversy, and imagination, remembered differently by every age that followed. For some, she was a tragic heroine. For others, a seductress who toppled empires. For still others, the last true pharaoh of Egypt,
who defied the might of Rome. Her legacy was as complex as the woman herself. For Octavian, soon to become Augustus, Cleopatra was both a warning and a tool. In his propaganda, she was portrayed as a foreign temptress who ensnared noble Antony, corrupting him with luxury and leading him to betray his Roman duties. Poets in Augustus's service, such as Horace and Propertius, painted her as the embodiment of decadent Eastern excess. Virgil, in his Aeneid, cast her as the dark queen opposing Rome's destiny, a rival to be vanquished so that the eternal empire could rise. Yet even as Augustus demonized her, he could not erase her allure. Romans whispered about her beauty, her charisma, her daring death. Statues and coins bearing her likeness circulated long after her fall, ensuring that her image survived even in the heart of her conqueror's city. In trying to destroy her reputation, Rome immortalized her instead. In Egypt, Cleopatra lived on as the last pharaoh, the final guardian of a kingdom that had endured for millennia. Though she was Macedonian by descent, she had embraced Egyptian language, customs, and gods more fully than her Ptolemaic predecessors. In temples, she had been depicted as Isis incarnate, mother of the nation and consort of Horus. To her people, her death marked not just the end of a dynasty, but the loss of independence itself. The Nile still flowed, the pyramids still stood, but Egypt's soul now bowed under Rome. Folk tales arose, painting Cleopatra not merely as a queen, but as a magician, a woman of secrets. Some said her tomb contained hidden chambers of treasure waiting to be discovered. Others believed she had not died at all, but ascended to the gods, watching over her people from the stars. Centuries later, Arab historians and poets revived her story, blending fact with legend. To them, Cleopatra was not only a queen, but also a scholar of alchemy and medicine, a wise woman who experimented with poisons and cures. Medieval texts described her as a master of knowledge, a figure of both danger and brilliance. In Renaissance Europe, Cleopatra became an emblem of passion and tragedy. Painters like Guido Reni and Artemisia Gentileschi depicted her final moments, the asp coiled at her breast, her face serene in death. To dramatists, she was the ultimate femme fatale, dangerous, seductive, yet undeniably captivating. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra gave her one of literature's greatest voices, a queen who refused to be diminished, whose love and pride elevated her above mere politics. In those verses, her spirit found immortality. During the Enlightenment, Cleopatra was reinterpreted once more. Some scholars dismissed her as little more than a schemer who used her sexuality to maintain power, a convenient stereotype in a male-dominated intellectual world. Others, however, admired her political cunning, her ability to navigate between Rome's greatest leaders and to protect her kingdom for nearly 20 decades. By the 19th century, with Napoleon's campaign in Egypt and the growth of Egyptology, Cleopatra returned to the spotlight. She was romanticized as the exotic queen, draped in jewels and mystery. Operas by Handel and Massenet, paintings by Jerome and Cabanel, and countless novels retold her story, each bending her image to fit the dreams of the age. Today, Cleopatra stands as one of the most recognized women in history. Scholars debate her true appearance. noting that ancient coins show a strong nose and angular features rather than the Hollywood ideal of beauty. Yet beauty alone cannot explain her power. What made Cleopatra unforgettable was her intellect, her fluency in multiple languages, her grasp of politics, her ability to hold her own against Rome's greatest leaders. In modern culture, she embodies resilience, femininity, and defiance. Films and literature have portrayed her in endless ways, as the doomed lover, the cunning strategist, the goddess reborn. For feminists, she represents a woman who refused to be silenced in a man's world. For Egyptians, she remains a reminder of their ancient grandeur, a queen who walked with pharaohs and stood against Rome itself. Perhaps Cleopatra's greatest legacy lies in her refusal to fade. Other rulers of her time are remembered only in dusty records and half-broken statues. But Cleopatra endures because she was not merely a monarch, she was a story, a myth, a mirror in which each generation sees something of itself. To the Romans, she was decadence, to poets, passion, to historians, power, to dreamers, eternal beauty. Standing at the edge of history, Cleopatra chose her own ending. She would not be paraded through Rome as a trophy. She would not be forgotten as the last of her line. She embraced death as she embraced life, with courage, with pride, with the unyielding will of a queen. And so, more than 2,000 years later, her name still carries weight. Cleopatra, the queen who defied an empire, the woman who became a legend. In her life and in her death, she taught the world that true power is not merely in armies or in gold, but in the ability to shape memory, to burn one's image into the hearts of generations yet unborn.